I need your mic? Oh, it's right here. So, yeah. Is it on? Yeah, it's right here. Ready? You sure it's on?
We know she's old enough to have
That has a charge back on it. So just, yeah, it's all. Sure. It's like if you're confident, Brittany, package. All right. Go up and take a seat. We're going to go ahead and get started.
Great.
I'd like to say welcome all to API Security Meetup. We're hosting it out of 1819 Innovation Lab for UC, University of Cincinnati. First up, I'd like to thank our two sponsors. We have Leslie from Engage Partners, if you'd like to come up and talk about it.
hilarious. Clapping really is not necessary.
Oh, yes.
That's all right, I'll take it. Thank you all for coming. I get so excited when we have a good turnout like this. This is such a great space. I work for a purpose-driven IT consulting company, so we're really into building in the community. And this is one way that we do it. There's several meetups, and this being one of them. And I think we're successful, if I can say so myself. So thank you all for coming. Spread the word, and if you ever want to speak, if you're interested, let us know.
All right, next up, we have our sponsors, Trace School here, and we're going to introduce Trevor first. Oh, no clapping.
Bill, thank you guys for having us. I've been attending the API Security Meetup since I joined Tracewell in February, and it's been just amazing to see and hear everything you guys are dealing with, the struggles that everybody deals with. So, thanks for letting me sit in the back of the room and listen to you guys. I appreciate it. Tracewell, we're a purpose-built API security platform. Not only do we go out and do discovery, which we feel is table stakes, we find every API, internal, external, third party, and more importantly, start to build contextualization of what that API is doing, what data is being transmitted by an API, and allows your teams to respond effectively. And we'll dive into a little bit of context tonight with Michael, and we'll introduce yourself.
All right, Michael.
You guys get to know I'm Michael right now. I already have a whole slide dedicated to me, because who doesn't? So just hi everybody. We'll talk more about me later.
Awesome. One other thing to call up is if anyone knows of any local meetups or any events that are coming up, please feel free to share them now. I do want to bring up that Queen City Conference. It's a security conference. It's happening Friday, Saturday, and Sunday downtown Cincinnati. There are tickets still available if you want to have a last-minute conference to go to. It's founded by a bunch of local companies, got together with some security folks. They created the Queen City Foundation and created out that security conference out there.
Is that this Friday?
This Friday, Saturday, so in 2 days, math-wise, yeah. In 2 days it starts up and they have events on Friday night, they go until midnight, Saturday they go until midnight, and then Sunday they're there. I will actually be presenting there as well on Sunday, and crazy enough, my CISO will be there for a panel talk with several other CISOs on Sunday afternoon. So there's quite a few people there. Any other local events?
Bill, did you want to mention the C3 or
Yeah, sure.
All right, we have Phil from Engage about C3.
All right, Engage Partners sponsors a meetup. It's a code crafting community. It's the C3 meetup. So it is whatever Wednesday this is. It's next Wednesday at Engage Partners. Show up, write some code, and eat some pizza. I just heard free dinner.
Awesome. A couple housekeeping items. One, you're at 1819, so the restrooms are actually in to go. Go out the door to the hallway, take a left, go all the way down, and they're on the back side of the big room back there. There's signs that'll take you there if you need to, but if you have any questions, reach out, I'll be in the back. The other housekeeping item is we are still working on the name, but we're actually going to take the API Security Meetup and broaden what we're going to cover. We're going to open it up to more API-centric topics, not just security. So think of API styles, API designs, architectural patterns, linting, all the latest technology and APIs. We're looking to broaden this out and attract more folks so that they start talking APIs. We'll still keep a security-focused mindset and bring up pressing issues, but we wanted to really harness more of that API conversation going forward. Without further ado,
Mike McDonald, not formerly of the Doobie Brothers. All right. All right, I'm going to put this here. Hopefully people online are, absolutely deafened by me. So, hi everybody, my name is Mike McDonald. Today we're going to talk about the idea of, bringing context into your security program. Why that's important. Why I think that's important, and what I think you can do out of this.
Who else's opinion matters?
I kind of agree. Who am I? Why should you care? So, I started my career just about 21 years ago. I don't know why I checked my watch for that because I can't remember what year it is. But as what we call today a full stack dev, but at the time it was a webmaster. So I was at my college and I was writing code. I was writing Flash. I was writing PHP, Cold Fusion. I was working on MySQL, total lamp stack, and we did everything from power and plugin all the way to writing all of the customer and internal customer student-facing code. And so from there, I went to Walgreens Corporate, where I was a developer in the pharmacy team. While I was at the pharmacy team, my job was to write whatever they told me to write in whatever language they told me to write it, and you just kind of figure it out from there. If you've ever walked into a Walgreens, saw a little sign that had your name on it that said what order you're going to get your prescription in, that was me. And they took it down promptly thereafter because I got sued for HIPAA violations. That's too bad. But that was right at the end of my development career, where I was doing CI/CD early on. It was cruise control, Ant scripts, and hopes and prayers. So we were using Subversion as our repository. Then I went over to the store side, which was actually called site architecture at the time. So my team was responsible for every single device in every single store, every single distribution center, every single call center, every single aspect of Walgreens that wasn't explicitly a data center. My team managed, and VDI. For whatever reason, nobody wanted to touch VDI besides my team. And so during that time, you got to learn a lot about security, you got to learn a lot about rules. I had to patch operating systems, I had to patch scales, I had to patch Parada machines that use serial interfaces, things like that. I had to understand how all of these things worked and how they all communicated with the platform, because we did a physical to virtual transformation of every single store in under a calendar year, based on largely the part of the automation code that me and my team wrote. From there, I ended up going to VMware. Funny enough, once you virtualize an entire set of stores, a company like VMware wants you to actually be there. I spent 3 years as a solutions engineer, and 2 years working on the group called the Hands-On Labs, where I was brought back in to do more CI/CD work with infrastructure. We were trying to build out how you could automate the building of all the infrastructure necessary for a person to take their labs. After that, I went to MuleSoft. For those of you who are not familiar, MuleSoft is an iPaaS platform, low code, drag and drop a lot of your coding. And then from there, I came to Traceable as of this last June. While I was at MuleSoft, I was their security and networking architect, engineer, specialist that would come in and help customers make sure everything got hooked together. So it's the reason why Traceable actually hired me, was because I understood how everything had to get wired together and get intercommunicating while also being able to talk to customers such as many of yourselves. On the side, I like to play with my dog. I have 2 cats, and I run a home lab. So it tells you I spend a lot of time still playing with computers, even when I'm done playing with computers for work. But that's enough about me. Let's get into it. So there we go. So my big perspective here is that context around API usage. Oh, and
working for Traceable, by the way, it is a contextual API security solution, so full disclosure, there's a slant here. I'm not gonna lie to you guys, you need to know this. And at the same time, I'm taking all my own ideas and everything I built up over years of working with many customers and in different perspectives, and I'm kind of building out way beyond even what Traceable does in my talk track today. So, what's my big idea? Context around API usage not only improves API security, but it also moves that needle from risk mitigation and into risk prevention. And now that I've read the slide, what does that mean? And I'm going to take a standard banking scenario. How many of you have logged into your bank account, checked an account or two, checked a few transactions, paid a bill, and logged out? Probably all of you, right? Absolutely. That's because that's kind of how that normally works. How many of you have logged into your bank account, changed your first name, last name, changed your address, changed your multi-factor token, and sent a bunch of money out of your bank account straight across the country to another bank?
That Nigerian guy.
Right.
You're under arrest, sir.
So what I'm telling you here is, like, if you look at these from a broad spectrum perspective, and I'm going to use a few, they're all 200s from an HTTP RESTful API standpoint. That's a little bit of wheat and a lot of chaff when you're trying to figure out what that means. So, understanding what's the context around how your solution's going to work is so critically important, because how else are you going to actually be able to figure out what's actually bad, even when everything looks good? We've been spending most of our time trying to figure out how do we protect things from this IP, that IP. We've spent so many times trying to figure out, is this the bad actor, is that the bad actor, is this the bad actor? But if you start understanding the context, the contextual flow of all of your APIs, and look at the calls of your APIs as a user story, suddenly you start to really gain a clear understanding of what actually is right and what actually could be wrong, right? And I say could be because you still have false positives, you still have that sort of scenario where that sort of thing happens. So in a few stats, we just performed a State of the API Security report where we went out and we interviewed thousands of customers. We talked to tons of customers all across the board through a third party, and we started to collect a whole bunch of different pieces of data. So, over 57% of the companies that we talked to has had a breach in the last 2 years. That's pretty intensive, especially given the fact that, like, how many security solutions exist in your company today, right? I'm sure all of us can list off no less than 5 or 6 or 7, maybe even 8 solutions that exist within your 4 walls right now. Over 63% of them have no idea, especially in security groups, have no idea what's the flow of API calls within the application. Most of the customers I've talked to don't even know what APIs they have within their platform. And so they don't even know what to protect, what to look for. You have 53% who basically say that, all of these bots, all of these things that are coming through are basically, they're spamming us so much, we have no idea how to see what's real versus what's not. It's so impossible to kind of get through all of that. And 73% have had at least 3 API breaches in the last 2 years. That's intense, And by the way, assuming this being an API security meetup, all of us here kind of have our job on the line on blocking many of these attacks as much as possible. We've seen massive amounts of financial loss. We've seen intellectual property loss. And we've seen brand value erosion. And not just because companies are screwing over their customers. I didn't say that too. Is that, or can we cut that?
Yeah,
All right, sorry.
You also have to fear what happens to SolarWinds, but the CISO was put on trial on SEC. That's most likely going to continue.
Correct, yeah. And these kinds of things are going to keep happening. So the thing is, it's actually probably going to get worse, especially now when Gen AI, large language models, not only are they helping companies drive and innovate forward, they're also helping bad actors drive and innovate forward. The nuclear escalation has already happened, So we're already in an arms race with the bad actors who are out there. And so, the question starts to become is, how do we prevent these things that are frustrating, like API sprawl? How do we make sure that you can cut down on some of these vulnerabilities, things like this? I'm not going to sit here and read all of the data on the slide, because I'm sure this slide deck is going to get shared with everybody when this is all over, so you can see all of these stats. They will be in your hands soon enough. I need to make sure I stay over here when I click that button. I'm so used to just pacing around. So you know, it's clear, at least to me, that your standard traditional solutions, the tools that are out there, are just not cutting the job. And we've seen an evolution of these things coming over the last several years. You know, I remember it was 2020, 2021, Salt was the king of API security. They were able to see things that no one else could see. And then kind of out of nowhere, No Name kind of took the world by storm. And, you know, and this is the last of my commercial, but, you know, Traceable's coming in right now, and we're trying to help build a contextual understanding of how you actually solve this problem. It's not that the others aren't, it's just this is our perspective, right? We're trying to figure out how do you solve this problem, how do you take a better understanding of all of the data that's being shot across everything, and making sure you can have an understanding of what's going on, especially when most security folk are not necessarily best friends with your devs. They just want to write code. They don't want to hang out with security folk and find out how they can make their code more secure. That's kind of an impediment to their job.
The security folks know how to party though.
You know what? I've heard that. And Gen AI is terrifying, as we've already kind of discussed. And first off, I'd like to make a clarification of my own personal opinion. Gen AI is not intelligent. It is correlation, and that's all it is. It should be LLMs and things like that. They are not. It is not intelligence. It just happens to be really good correlation. So you know, but all these companies are taking it and they're adopting it just wholesale. You know, and in fact, a lot of companies have had to block OpenAI.com just to make sure that they don't squeeze ChatGPT into the middle of their code or share IP, you know, with the world every time they make a query. These sorts of things are very real threats to our organizations. So we get it, right? And by the way, if this does run way short of an hour, I apologize, because I'm kind of skipping over some of these boring details and some of these things. So just questions should be, please bring them in. You know, if you have questions as I come through this. So we've beaten the dead horse, right? So now what do we need to do? We need to start really building on the context. We need to start building on how do we understand the flow of things. Every single series of API calls across all of the services tell a story. They tell a story of what did a user do when they were walking through your platform. You know, we think of user interfaces as that, but APIs are just user interfaces as well. They just have to be user interfaces for people who write code. And so understanding what's the expected paths, what are the known forks in the road, what are the known deviations where you finally make yourself back to the main thoroughway, and being able to build a mathematical regression on that is how you're going to be able to start really understanding where your normal behavior starts to come in versus where your less normal, less good behavior starts to come in. And in order to do that, you need tools, not just one tool. And I'm going to be totally transparent about this. My solution will solve one small part of the problem, but we have this problem across the entirety of the stack. This starts at infrastructure and it ends at the end user. You know, you still have situations like social engineering. You still have situations where you have, physical compromises, things like that. You still have situations where people are just downloading this really cool cat video that just happens to also be secretly exfiltrating all of your HIPAA data that you had in that Excel file right out of your systems. So we can't pinpoint APIs as your primary solution. We can at least start with something. And I know there's other tools that do a lot of this stuff in a lot of the other places within the ecosystem. We're just going to have to, but we have a little bit of stumbling blocks to start figuring this. But the thing that I would encourage you all to do, and I'm going to actually just call this out later in the thing, is, as customers, you need to push on your vendors. When I was at Walgreens, pushing on the vendor, I had 3 releases of Teradici and 2 releases of VMware that had part of my thumbprint on it. And that was the coolest thing in the world to me. It was, we need this because otherwise we don't have an answer without it. And if your vendors have the opportunity to push these kind of changes, you have the power to kind of influence the bus, to move it forward the way you need it to move. And I encourage you to do that. So if we look at the software development lifecycle, which it does all kind of fall back into dev at the end of the day, right? We all exist here today because there are developers somewhere. There are either developers in our org, there are developers in other orgs, there are developers somewhere that all need to kind of fall in the same bus. So it all really does start in the design phase. It really does. And some people say, well, good documentation is paramount. Consumable documentation is paramount, right? In this situation, it's how you understand how you can how you're going to do this. And as security folk, we need to remember that we're in the business of risk mitigation. We need to figure out that business wants to push forward. They want to be leading edge in some cases. So how do we mitigate the risks that are opened up when they want that new chatbot? How do we make sure that we can give them what they want and limit our attack surface, and we limit our blast radius when things do go wrong? And so how can you be an enabler in the design phase? Now, this is not a phase that security is usually invited to, because security is so well known for saying that dangerous two-letter word that so many of us have been told to never say in a meeting ever again.
Breach.
No, two-letter word. Yes. You need to understand where, security as an underlying framework of how you do things is really a great concept, and personally, I have yet to see it be done in a really efficacious way. Where it's truly streamlined, it's truly just part of everyone's ebb and flow. So what it does mean is, at least today, you need to look at the design and you need to go, well, we can be here, and we can be here, where at least if something goes wrong, we can slam the door shut. We can make sure that things don't get out or things don't get in as necessary. And I think that it's very easy for everyone to kind of just say, yeah, I get it. But no, you need to get it. You need to be in that design phase, because this is where things like business logic attacks are born, because people don't necessarily think about RBAC in their APIs at design time. They're like, oh yeah, the user will have access to this API. Well, which user? Which user should have access to this, which user doesn't? And when you're bolting on security as an afterthought, that makes it really hard. It makes it really easy to block broad spectrum attack scenarios. Like, oh, you're not authorized? Of course you don't get into this API. But what about a situation where it's like, oh, but I'm a user, of course I can, and this is actually a real situation. One of the customers I was working with was a vehicle company, not in this area, because I want to call out, not anywhere in the Midwest. And we had a situation where you could post orders on someone else's order sheet, but it would still go to you, right? So you could come in and buy a car on someone else's dime, but we only found that through a pen test. And it was because we paid attention to the context of, okay, I can only see these 15 orders, but if I increment my number or if I modify my UUID, suddenly I can see other people's orders. I can do all 4 major options on them. I can get, I can post, I can put, I can patch, I can delete, right? That's really dangerous when you consider the fact that security is such a whole lot. This is what I mean. And the point, if I was trying to get it across here, is like, if you can get injected at design time, even if it's just to listen, you don't need to say anything. You don't need to slow down the ball. You just need to see. You just need to say to yourself, I can be there, I can be there, and I can be there. So that way I have a better chance of actually protecting things when they go wrong. And the developers aren't going to pay attention to anything you have to say, because most of the time you can go, well, what about this? What about that? And they're going to be like, that's not important. We need to develop this by this date, because those dates are so important. So just remember, being there at design time is so important. Then infrastructure. Infrastructure is, it's funny. I remember, I think it was 2015, 2016 when the concept of serverless started to get really big. Everybody loved the idea of not needing a server anymore, because they had so many nightmares working with their infrastructure teams trying to actually get servers. But infrastructure is still the basis of every single thing we do. There's a computer running something somewhere, and when you're in security, your job is to keep that security as safe as possible. I once had a security researcher tell me, the only safe computer is one that's been filled with concrete, dipped in acid, and thrown in the bottom of the ocean. I was like, wow, all right. Someone can still dig that up, though. Probably do the acid first, is just all I'm saying. But, there are frameworks out there there are really good models out there today, and especially, you know, this is where Gen AI and has the ability to actually be really effective. It's so easy to now make soft, human, mushy word queries that basically say, how do I actually protect this thing in the most easy way possible, but in the most effective way possible? How do I balance that? And this is a place where you can get things like, for example, you can actually look through Amazon's entire well-architected framework for those of us who are in AWS shop, and you can actually say, how do I implement, you know, well-architected this? How do I implement well-architected that? And most LLMs will take you probably 99.95% accurate versions of exactly step-by-step what you need to do, which makes it 100% more effective than any of Amazon's documentation. You know, you need to also pay attention to the fact that, like, you know, there's an operational overhead to every single thing we do to try to protect this stuff. So being able to understand, like, you know, okay, I've got 5 agents. True story, when I was at Salesforce, I had 3 agents on every single machine. And that kept me from using an Amazon free tier tiny to pushing it up to an Amazon paid tier small. Every single time, because they alone required something to the tune of 1 gig of RAM and probably about 20% of my CPU by themselves. I won't tell you what the solutions are, but they're well-known solutions. And so having an understanding of, like, how can we have protected some of this stuff without necessarily having to deal with all of these agents and all of these things, you know, that helps us also look at how do we reduce operational costs. You know, because just a quick question for everybody. Who's had their budget cut in the last 2 years? Yeah. And realistically, when all the numbers are telling you right now that not only should my budget not be cut, it probably should be increased 300%, so I can finally afford all of these expensive solutions that are supposed to help me figure out where the bad guys are and help save the money, save the company so much money. So it's something to think about here too, is like, you know, strike in the best place. Where are you going to get the most bang for your buck? You know, in a situation where my company does a fair amount of, like, discovery, you know, everyone likes to look at the deep dive, like, what's on the ground, what can we get the absolute most data? That's really great, except for, well, that's an agent over there, that's another agent over there, there's a VM over there, you know, and, like, that's great if you have the capacity, if you have the automation, if you have the mechanisms to build that and put those in. But, like, if I could put a policy on my F5 that does 90% of that work, that means I've saved somebody a crap load of time. I have saved 1 to 2% of my CPU, maybe 256 megs of RAM, right? Like, that's small in an individual, but that's massive in aggregate. So, and by the way, just for what it's worth, right, our solution's really good. I'm just kidding. But, like, at the same time, you know, looking for where those big bangs for the bucks are, where you can really start to gain an understanding and understand the context of the flow of that data through your system is so important, because that's where you're going to be able to spend the least amount of human time, the least amount of maintenance time, and the least amount of teardown time at the end of the life cycle, because everything has a life cycle at the end of the day, you know. And what I would say is, you know, north-south protection is awesome. Like, we all have north-south protection. Everyone in this room has a firewall somewhere within their organization. And east-west is better, but not at the cost of the business, and not at the cost of speed of business, and not at the cost of driving forward everything that you need to do within your organization. So what I'm saying here is that, like, you know, bang for buck, you know, especially in the infrastructure space, where you have the ability to stack up multiple bangs for buck and maybe mitigate that risk in a very different way. Before I go any further, is what I'm saying kind of jiving with everybody? I see nods, but I'm just kind of looking for a little bit of feedback. Has anyone had a situation where you've seen where you've made kind of decisions like this, kind of based on this, maybe not necessarily as straightly articulated or poorly articulated as myself?
Yeah, I mean, context is always key. It's following through. Even with the well-known patterns, you can go low and slow attacks and get around a lot of these patterns, because you're slowly, your original example of going to your bank, log in, change all these fields. If I do that over a 4-hour period where you're still going to catch it in the normal sense, right? Because
Correct.
the big attacks of go away, dump all this stuff and get out, we're gonna notice that quickly, without a tooling of like, hey, this is some weird behavior, what's going on? But if I do it slowly, you won't see it.
Correct. So for those of you online who didn't get a chance to hear that, in the corner we had, context is king. It is. And basically that, if you look at the fact that things like low and slow attacks can possibly, be slip by the radar because they're not big rapid fire attacks, they don't trigger any alarms. They're all still 200s, just like we talked about before. So it's a lot, you're not just under an attack at any given, period of like a minute. No, and like many of these companies, I've talked to, they're under attack for periods of years, In fact, you'll see a lot of stories of like, agents that are just sitting inside of machines collecting the data they need to, and they'll send out a ping or something like that periodically. That's just weird, but not nearly enough to catch it. But that ping is a packet full of necessary data that they're just that little bit that they're looking for. So things like that. So this is a consideration too. This is a great story. There is and this is totally on topic but off topic of the presentation. So my CISO at Trade School was told a story of a red team attack that was going up against they were just doing red team, blue team exercises. They invited the developers to come in and watch the attacks. And he said it was such a great experience because the developers got to see, how did this work? What sort of things can happen? Well, one of the developers was standing over the shoulder of the hacker or the red teamer, and he was like, and finally he stands up and he shouts like, "That's not how that's supposed to be used." And the guy's like, "That's the point. Thank you." And for those of you who don't know me, which is everybody, I grew up on a farm in the middle of Iowa. I can't tell you the number of times we had to use a pair of pliers as a hammer, and as a screwdriver, and as a wrench, and as a pry bar, and as the list goes on and on and on. So just remember, especially in the idea of infrastructure, and the idea of protecting this stuff, like bang for buck, especially at the infrastructure level, where it's cheap to do and cheap to stack things up, relatively speaking, to human time, to man hours, to operational hours. Because even though we like to split things into CapEx and OpEx, it's still money out of the same pocket. Development lifecycle, right? Development is very similar to design in the fact that you're still operating in the same concept of a unified flow of logic and a unified flow of everything, right? And especially as a security organization, you should, in my opinion, every single aspect of security should basically be automated. There should be no single point of security that at the very most should have an approve or deny button, in my opinion. And the reason is because more often than not, idiots like me in the infrastructure and development space will just blow right by you. If no one, I'd rather ask for forgiveness 1,000 times over than ever ask for permission. And if no one's going to yell at me for doing something wrong, I'm assuming they don't care, right? And I say this as a person who has, we tested a lot in production at Walgreens. Full disclosure, it is a safe place, but just keep your passwords changed. Developers want to minimize barriers, and security should look at that very seriously and go, how can I minimize anything that gets in your way? If I'm a developer and I need a firewall rule, or a development organization, I need a firewall rule, how many people have had to basically tell somebody you need to wait no less than 1 week for a firewall rule, right? Yeah, we used to have to wait 6 months for firewall rules unless they were in the store. That's crazy. At that point we were just kind of like, cool, we'll just change the port and run it over 22. We did that a lot because it was like, I can't afford to wait. The business can't afford to wait. So finding mechanisms that allow you to have, turnkey, push button, simplified patterns that push these things forward, totally helps you out so much. And in the development space too, one of the things I want to call out here is this is where Gen AI makes its way into your organization. The developer might ask a question, might start utilizing it. They might just create a prompt, make a call out, they get their instruction set back, and they go, right? It depends on how fancy they want to get, but it's a thing that happens all the time. And they don't tell anyone about it. Somebody just in the line of business just swipes a credit card. Has anyone seen this happen? I was gonna say, yeah. So just saying, go talk to some of your lines of business and just ask them, are you using Gen AI? Some of them will say, I don't know what that means. You have a credit card for ChatGPT? Oh yeah. There you go. You're using Gen AI. Congratulations, right? These sorts of things are pretty common in a lot of spaces because, again, it's about getting the business to move forward. Security needs to be there with them lockstep because they're not going to pay attention to you in any other way, shape, or form. Testing. I can't stress enough how much I hate testing. Writing tests is boring. Executing and waiting on tests is boring. Fixing broken tests is boring. In 2018, I was charted, when I was on the hands-on labs with VMware, I was tasked with, you need to write a series of APIs that will allow us to run this new game mode that we're going to inject inside of VMware's hands-on labs. It was called Odyssey. And it was much like Dante's trip through the Inferno. And what I'll tell you is that the only thing that kept us from having constant breaks in our production when we had to make changes the day of, was the fact that I was smart enough to write regression tests for the first time ever. The fact that that was there, it kind of put on a light bulb in my head that, like, okay, this is actually really important because I have screwed up my code more times than I have written good code. I guarantee it. And so having a mechanism in place to allow you to test the security boundaries of every single system, both greenfield and brownfield, on the fly, as part of the build process, is incredibly important because not only is it going to let you catch those errors early, but you're going to catch them before that deadline. That deadline where somebody in product, someone's going to say, I accept the risk, push it out anyway, which you see all the time in business because they don't really understand what it means to accept the risk, and they don't really carry the risk most of the time. And so I'm sure some of you who are, in charge of your various organizations are like, guys, this is a really bad idea, and they're like, I don't care, do it anyway. That happens a lot. I've seen that happen. I saw that happen multiple times at Walgreens when I called out that the CAPTCHA didn't actually block anything on our script egress. This was 2008. It's fixed. Don't worry. So coming into it too, right? Like coming back to context. This is where understanding the flow of everything through every single aspect of your organization. We're going from there to there. We're taking this path. This kind of data is shared in this path. Testing is going to exploit that. It's going to show a lot of that. And it's going to allow you to detect a lot of your business logic attack scenarios in a controlled fashion. And so that's white box testing, for those of you who are not familiar with the development vernacular. It also allows you to do your own chaos monkey, Netflix style. Let's break something on purpose. How does the application respond? That's just as important as security. I've seen a couple of situations where a API call out throws a 500, and they just dump the entire stack trace in the 500. It's really great in development. It's so easy to kind of go figure out what just went wrong. But boy, when you get to prod, you don't want that there. Because now all of a sudden everybody can see your SQL query. They can see your database connection timeout. They can see all your parameters, all of your table names, etc. And so it's so important to have an understanding of what's going on, when, where, how, and being able to understand the context of why that's important, and being able to do it in a controlled fashion. So I can't stress enough, like as much as I even hate it personally, testing is super important.
The importance of testing is writing the right test, not just getting a test coverage.
Correct.
Too many people go after that test coverage that they forget why they're actually writing the test.
Yes.
If the function is like 5 lines long because you need to test it, maybe not. Depends on the context.
Yes. Yes. And so what he said is that test coverage is so super important, and understanding why you're testing and what you're testing for is super important. I'm looking at the camera so everybody online can tell. And it's because your function call might be 5 lines, but there might be a really critical 5 lines in there. Line 4 might be the most critical part of your application. It's hard to tell. And so having a good test, not just any test, and understanding what that test is trying to get is super important, because I am definitely guilty of commenting out tests just so I can get things moving. So, you know, a lot of this I speak from my own painful experience just as well. So, we're in production now. Everything's fine. I'm sure it's just fine, right? And this is where the real testing begins, whether you thought so or not. Because no matter what you think, you said, here's a hammer, and somebody stuck the claw in and started turning it around in a circle so they could unscrew a screw, right? And they were like, why is this so hard to use? Well, you're holding it wrong, right, Steve Jobs? And so understanding, you know, the situation of confidence in whether or not someone's attacking you. This is super important as well, because as somebody who understands computers, understands logic, I mean, in Chrome, does everybody know what the F12 key does? F12 brings up your developer console. How many times have you sat there and watched a couple of things and go, oh, so that's how it works. I'm going to steal that API so I can do what I want with it. I've done it a number of times, mostly because, you know, I do a bunch of home assistant stuff, I do a bunch of my own automation. Sometimes, you know, you can't find the automation you're looking for on GitHub or something like that, so you just make it yourself, you know? When my bank account goes to 0, send all the lights in my house to red. That's a very important one in my house. Kidding. You know, so you know, I call that legitimate misuse. That's not a hack. That's not really an attack. That's just a situation where somebody has decided to misuse your API against its original intent. And so understanding what these kinds of attacks look like, what sorts of things are happening here, that confidence score is super important to gain an understanding of, well, are they really a bad person or are they just a jerk, you know? And what you'll probably find even on that bell curve is that probably over 50% of the time, they're just a jerk just trying to screw with something, right? So you don't need to ban them, you don't need to block them, you don't need to punish them. You just need to go, oh, that's cute, let's patch that one out. You know, something to that effect. And so, you know, this comes back to a lot of what we've talked about already. And, you know, if no one else has seen it or has heard it really, understanding context means you can detect fraud. Understanding context means you can detect the things that you can't see. Understanding context means that you're able, or you can't easily see, I should say, right? You know, understanding context means you can see, you know, a red dot, or a sea of red in a series of 200s where everything else normally looks green. This is so important to every organization, especially moving forward, because as you understand more and more of the context of how your applications work, as you understand more and more of the context of how the data flows within your organization, the more you're going to actually start to understand the outliers of the problem. Right? It's all a simple math equation. Simple, right? At the end of the day. Day 2. I think day 2 is the redheaded stepchild of all technology. Everyone, if you're not familiar with that term, that just means it's the abused one who we throw in the corner that nobody pays attention to. Every single solution on the market that I have seen, you know, as a customer in my own life, install, config, manage, super easy. Day 2, I need to patch, I need to upgrade, I need to change something. Nightmare. Every single time. And the reason is because that's not the part you sell on. You know, that's not the part you have to pay attention to, you know, from a technology organization standpoint, unless you're planning on having really long relationships with your customers, which we all love to say you have, but sometimes you don't. Customers like to choose different tools every now and then, and that's okay. That's what they should do. That's how the market evolves. But if you look at scenarios like, for example, Nutanix versus VMware, when the reason Nutanix came on the scene, the reason why Nutanix was so successful, for those of you who don't know it, Nutanix is a alternate management service it was an alternate management service for VMware hypervisors. Hypervisors are what we use to run VMs, just in case to make sure everyone's out of date. Nutanix had a one-button click to upgrade everything. There was no, oh, go into this tool and select these 15 things and make sure they're the right things and then stage them. Okay, now they've been staged, cool. Now we have to go through a cycle of shutting things down and turning them on so they all patch up and everything. No, it was push the button and it did all of it for you. the reason they blew up, the reason they became the contender in the market they are today, was because they understood how powerful day 2 was in operating your infrastructure. This is where I'm going to say, push on your vendors. If you have a situation where you have a tool where managing it, upgrading it, maintaining it isn't great, it isn't easy, it isn't built into the product, this is where you have an inordinate amount of power, because you control the dollar in that situation. And I say that knowing full well, I work for a software company that, you know, has some work to do on day 2. And it's because that takes a lot more effort, that takes a lot more concentration, that takes a lot more time. But, you know, this is the hard part of making sure you stay secure. This is the hard part of making sure that you keep the bad guys out. And unfortunately, this is also the part where security usually gets involved, because it's almost always to a reaction to an event. You don't have the ability to be proactive because nobody told you what was going on, right? So finding a way to make sure that you're involved before day 2 is super critical, especially so you can understand the context of the things you're trying to protect. And if you don't have a tool that can help you play catch up very quickly when you run into a situation like this, you need to get one, right? I don't care if you build it yourself, throw out your own, build out your own CMDB of some sort, and like really start to gain, like, build your own vector database and your own personal internal LLM, or you buy a tool off the shelf. Whatever you do, make sure you can make this as easy as possible, because this is how you lower costs. This is how you get a better time to value from a perspective of from a security context, a security lens. Software development lifecycle, retirement, deprecation, shutting things down. How many people have been to their data center? Yeah. Nobody?
I've been.
Okay, yeah. How many beige servers exist in that data center? Yeah. When I was at Walgreens, in their first data center, which has since been brought offline, compliments of what they called a exothermic discharge. They had an entire segment of the data center called Dinosaur Alley, and what it was the original corner of the data center when it was still just a colo before they bought out the whole thing, where most of those boxes were still running. Some of them were AS400s. Some of them were actual mainframes that they just still hadn't shut down because they were afraid to, because they didn't know what was still connecting to them.
Some of them were desktop PCs that said do not turn off.
Yeah, exactly, right? Like, so this is a real scenario in any business that's basically older than 20 years old at this point. There is a data center with some beige computers that still have a 5 1/4 floppy disk in it. I guarantee you. Guarantee it to all of you. Old APIs are very, very, very vulnerable place to go. And in fact, more often than not, if you're looking at an API and you see /v2, /v1's still probably online and hasn't been patched since v2 came out. Hasn't been looked at since v2 came out, right? More often than not. More often than you're certainly comfortable with, I'm sure of that. And this is true in your banks. This is true in your grocery stores. This is true in absolutely most of your retailers, and there's nothing wrong with that, right? Like this is just the reality. You come in, no matter how long you've been there, and you have to wrap your arms around this thing that's growing exponentially every single day, right? So it's certainly not your fault. It just happens to be your problem, And so understanding the context. Understanding the history, understanding how those things came to be, understanding that, oh, that's weird. No one's called that API in 5 years and now all of a sudden it's busy? You should probably look into that. But you need something that tells you something's different, right? You need something that understands the context of the situation. So, coming into it, right? What's in it for you? Why do you care about this? What are you looking for? It's the same things I've been saying here, right? Like, you're looking for better business alignment. You're looking to understand what you own, why you own it. You're looking to reduce your operational costs because you want to reduce that mean time to resolution of any possible issue that's out there, which means you need that better noise to signal ratio. you need to be able to understand that maybe instead of having to deal with something like an agent fatigue, you can actually detect it back here, but block it out there so it never even makes it into your data center. Now all of a sudden you're saving on CPU strokes, disk strokes, RAM strokes, my own strokes, right? Like you're now being able to actually have a quantitative effect on your environment, on your entire company, by being able to catch things back here and block them out there without having to have a series of things back here to help you do that. You know, you're looking at faster vulnerability discovery and mitigation because now you're able to catch the outliers. You already have that testing in place. We've done all of this magical stuff we talked by integrating ourselves into the software development lifecycle, right? This all is so important for you to really dig in. And you know, it could be anything from like, you know, hey, I'm using an eBPF agent. I was able to track this thing. We were able to correlate it with those elk logs. Great. So now what we can do is we can actually go out to our Cloudflare edge, turn on a block on the worker, and now it never comes back in there. And that means that you mitigated that risk in one place rather than potentially 40 or 50 places down in the lower environments, plus everything that that packet has to travel through to get there. That also means you need less people to maintain all that problem. Not that people don't need jobs, it's just more that like now you can focus on innovation. You can focus on how can I do better automation? How can I do, you know, and by the way, if you can automate yourself out of a job, you can get a better job. Just calling that one out there right now. Like there's no situation where you should not automate, where you should not be hyper fixated on making your day easier every single day, in my opinion. Right? Your brand reputation improves. Your loyalty improves because people are getting scrupulous by fraud. You know, in these situations, you have the ability to really come in and start to understand that like you're actually able to improve the overall financial state of the company with little or big changes in how you view context within your application flow, within your security organization, and how it applies to the business itself. So we made it. This is literally the end, and I don't know if I burned a full hour. I actually have no idea how long I've been talking. But you know, what I'd like to make sure you all remember is that you know, context, understanding the context of your stuff allows you to really understand what's important, right? Like some of us have seen Moneyball, and if you haven't seen Moneyball, it's a fun movie. It's a good movie. And it talks about some really good concepts about how they were able to look at the statistical analysis of baseball players and win a whole bunch more, right? Similarly, you look at the statistical analysis of how your API calls are made, or anything else within your organization, you're going to be able to save a lot more money. Big picture, right? Big business logic attacks require tools that understand context. Because if you don't understand context, there's no way to detect something like an OWASP top 10, like Ebola or a BFLA, without knowing beforehand that that person's not supposed to have access to that, right? So you have to be able to gain context out of that, right? Minimizing barriers to success for your developers, because they're kind of your customers and kind of not, right? Minimizing those barriers to success, minimizing those barriers to entry force from a security lens means that they're going to come to you more often because it means you give them an answer that they like more often.
Lead with the carrot, not with the stick.
You say again?
Lead with the carrot, not with the stick.
Yes, lead with the carrot, not with the stick. It's actually very true, right? And you know, the last thing I was saying is like, you know, good tools need to help you play catch up very quickly. They need to give you the information you need at a glance to be helpful, to be useful, to actually help you drive your business forward. So, discussion time, and this is where I'm going to ask you questions because you guys did not interrupt me nearly enough today. Anyone who wants to answer, please just raise a hand. If given a magic wand, if you had a tool that you could add to your security program right now, what would it be? You don't have to say the name of the actual software, or you can, I don't care. And what problem would it solve? It's calm, and it's all your API security. That's the correct answer, right? No kidding.
To go with the developer mindset, right? Not necessarily a tool, but just golden path repos. Like, here's a sample repo that takes care of 80% of core libraries that do authentication, authorization, and you hit the ground running right in business logic.
So what he said was golden path repos that provide 80% of what you need your application to do right off the bat, so you can basically hit the ground running.
Netflix did it with Zool, their Zool Gateway, and they have a good blog post on this where they said, hey, if you're using the Zool Gateway, you eliminate the 140 questions that we're going to ask you from security because they've already prepackaged a lot of that stuff for developers.
So I'm going to have to give you this microphone if you keep talking. So what he said was that Netflix wrote a blog post on the Zool Gateway, which helped them save a ton of time because they prepackaged a whole bunch of things inside that gateway, which made it a lot easier for them to actually get through security boundaries as a result. Anyone else? All right. Does anyone have an example of a process that they'd like to see automated within their organization today? Like what's something that just you have to do 5, 10, 15 minutes a day, a week, whatever, that you'd love to see gotten rid of?
Time sheets.
Time sheets. No? All right, that's cool. That's cool.
Oh, come on. Really? 5, 10
Not even
minutes?
one?
I would say honestly just OWASP considerations.
OWASP
So
considerations.
many developers that don't understand the basics of OWASP,
Yep.
that are plenty out there, that we just have to keep repeating the conversation. If more people would be educated on that, it would help.
So what he'd like to see automated is developers learning OWASP, basically. So what he wants to do is the matrix thing where he injects that needle in their head. I'm not sure if that's where that ends, but what he wants to make sure is they all learn things. So we'll go with that at the very least.
What about pipelines and linting and at deployment time, things like that?
Pipelines, linting, deployment information, right? Like these are really good options. And I guess I was kind of hoping to like spur some conversation amongst ourselves, but that's all right. I guess then, since this is actually the very last slide I have, do you have questions for me?
Yes.
Sir?
All right, so I'm thinking what you are calling context, I'm thinking is understanding normal behavior. And I don't think of that as context necessarily. I still see value in it. I just think it's something different. Because if you discover 8,000 APIs somewhere, like, look, your software doesn't understand what the developer necessarily intended for that API call to do. I would argue the software can discover the API exists, and then it can learn what is the normal behavior pattern of it, and when something falls outside of the normal, hey, I might want to know it. So the context thing, maybe I'm struggling with a little bit.
Okay, yeah. So I will say you're probably 80%, 90% right. What I would say is that scenarios where context is absolutely necessary is a API is a situation like OWASP Top 1, Bola, right? You can't possibly tell what, from an externalized gateway perspective, what accounts you have at Chase Bank or Wells Fargo or whatever, without actually having listed those accounts in a previous call and then seeing a different account number that was not on that list in a later call. That's context. That's not just normal behavior. That's actually being able to look into the package and understanding what's there and what should be here. So I would say you're mostly right in as much as like you're absolutely yes. Like understanding normal behavior in terms of a regression of like what pathing is everyone taking through the API paths. Yes, you're 100% right. But understanding what's inside of each one of those response bodies, right, inside of each one of those calls, is just as important as understanding the pathing, because even a situation like Ebola will appear as 200 and will look completely normal in just the regression, but it will be abnormal in terms of the actual data inside of it.
Yeah, and then I think the other one I was wondering about with you is, and I don't know your mother, so I can't use her, but I know my mother. So if you were to describe to my mother, hey, this is my friend Michael.
Yep.
What do you do for a living? Can you explain to me what your company does in mom version?
In mom version.
Yeah.
So what my company does in mom version is we look at how computers talk to each other, and we look at it from the perspective of which user is using that computer, and making sure that only that user sees only what they're supposed to see when they're supposed to see it. That's the easy answer I would give to my mom, because otherwise I normally just tell people, I work on computers. You don't need to understand it.
In I'm very inquisitive, right, so sorry if I'm
No, this is exactly,
The other thing I'm curious
everybody in
about-
here to ask questions like that, like challenge me, let's go.
So, like when I look at the space, right, I look at no name, wall alarm, installed, traceable, et cetera, et cetera. You all give me the same mock version, right, so.
Yes.
Like
So you're
why
thinking, what's the
trace-
differentiation?
Yes.
Correct, okay. So, the differentiation is that I'm keeping track of where you're supposed to be all the time and not just in the moment. And that's a big part of it. You know, I'm paying attention to the fact, you know, going back to that bullet situation, you could be looking at someone else's order, for example, and it would be completely normal for you to look at an order out of context, right? But in context, and understanding that, like, you know, you're not supposed to be there in this specific situation because of these reasons, right? And I can draw that list out because I am maintaining a learning model of what you're supposed to be doing as an individual user. And what you're supposed to be able to see as an individual user.
And does the industry recognize that's the difference that you guys bring to the table, or is that what you?
It's certainly what we tell everybody. I don't want to speak for an industry that I can't honestly say that I'm a world-class expert in, because there's so often times, like when I went to Black Hat this year, I looked at 90% of the businesses, and I was like, who the hell is that? You know, and it was mostly because I came from a more traditional infra and development space. So like I was very familiar with Spring Boot, I was very familiar with Java, I was very familiar with operating in .NET, I was very familiar with Rust and other languages, but I never really got into the security industry until I started working at MuleSoft. And even then, it was network security more than anything else. So what I would say is that I believe that there is a tide turning where maintaining this kind of context is getting to be more important. And I do believe that because the fact that other tools are not succeeding by maintaining a stateless approach. The stateless approach is lightweight. The stateless approach is easy. And it doesn't necessarily give you all the information you need in a modern era with things like LLMs and Gen AI. Sir?
Here we talk about it. It sounds like the tool is basically rebuilding the RBAC that is in the software.
In a sort of way. What we're doing is we're reviewing payloads and basically saying, that's weird. You know, this payload, which is clearly adjacent to this payload, to this call out, doesn't contain the data in here that was in here. And oftentimes in RESTful APIs, /counts. That will give you a list of IDs, that will give you a list of this, that will give you a list of that, right? But then /count/ID, there should be a correlated callback. Now for us, that's a customizable option, right? Like we can basically say, yeah, this is your metadata explicitly for what you need to be looking for in a later case, right? So what we're really doing is not necessarily rebuilding the RBAC, because that would imply that we're testing and pushing on things like that in a live traffic scenario, which we're not. What we are doing though is we're contextualizing the information as it comes through, and then when we get a chance to look back upstream after we've gone 6 steps forward, we're like, well, wait a minute, it doesn't make sense that we be here when we didn't have that information back here. Sir?
To put it in, I guess, more common terms is what context tracking is in API is your user analytics for web page on what are users doing, except in API you're siphoning those logs in that traffic and saying, hey, we want our users to click on this page, and you see the response times like a web browser does. But now we're saying in APIs, hey, we're seeing people trail off and go to this other path, or just kind of sit there for a while doing nothing until they start making a lot of calls.
Well, and that's certainly a situation to the 80–90% you was talking about before, but that doesn't solve for your goal as your bit was, etc. That does solve for your fraud scenarios pretty well. You still have to understand what's inside of these things and understand that like you take every step you take is informed by the step you took previously, right? Unless you're posting your data in, which by the way, that's a step you took previously. So understanding that, like, especially in these, what's the word I'm looking for? Organized systems, where it's not just a random collection of data, right? And even something like a Wikipedia, which you could argue kind of is kind of a random collection of data, you're still hopping and you can still maintain referrals, right? So you're in a situation where you need to understand not only the pathing, but you need to understand the data. You need to understand the context of that data and the fact that data here was informed by data here.
Would you say that you're more API security for production runtimes versus pre-prod deployments?
No. I would say
That was my impression.
It's certainly what we step forward with as traceable. We would like to be in production spaces because that's where the real test begins. As I said on the slide, that's where the real fun happens. In a pre-prod scenario, things are usually pretty boring, right? Like you have some activity going on, you have some call-outs being made, but it's generally a lot lighter and a lot less interesting unless you're actively seeking to do pen testing attacks and things like that.
Well, that contextual logic checking piece in pre-deployment would be pretty damn useful.
Yes, it would. Yes, and that was kind of my point, is that like, we like to start, we leave with prod, because that's a great place to be, but at the same time, every aspect of your organization is always wonderful. It doesn't, it's always a matter of a when, never an if. So from my perspective, would I love it if we had a mechanism to have you implemented in, dev, QA, UAT, prod, performance tests, etc.? Heck yeah, it would. That'd be great. Not only would I finally buy my 1996 Corolla on my commission check, but I also would be able to finally, to say, yeah, we actually have full scope of visibility, and with the appropriate tuning, now I can actually take expectations I learned in pre-prod and apply them to prod when that release comes through. That's a feasible thing, that's not a real thing yet. Just want to call that one out there, that's just me brainstorming, but it is feasible when you can maintain and share that context across multiple environments.
And how do you guys monetize your software?
So, depending on the mechanism, in live traffic, we're watching API calls. Calls specifically. But in a testing scenario, we're looking at how many test runs do you do. So, and by the way, test runs do not count as API calls. So that way, you're not getting double charged.
Okay.
Yeah. So, cool. That's about the gist of it. I talked for way too long. I hope this was interesting. I hope this was helpful. And funny enough, I got reminded last night to bring my business cards, and I did not bring them. So, all of you can contact me through this guy.
Yes, by all means. Reach out if you guys really want to have the contact information, reach out on Meetup if you want to, or just go to our Meetup page and find the slide deck once they post it, which I believe has your contact in there anyways. You can always find them on LinkedIn as well. Just one final housekeeping item, we do skip December for Meetup just because people are traveling, vacations, everything that goes around with it. So our next meeting or meetup will be in January, second Wednesday of January, and we should be back. We'll post the topic then and you get it out there. All right?
All right.
Good night, also.